Hi everyone. So, as you know, I'm a big fan of this set of rules, Soldiers of God by Warwick Kinraid, and played a couple of, well, several solo games, some of which I've shown on the channel in the past. And last year, I actually managed to get a game at a local wargaming club with a friend of mine, and he was really taken with the rules as well. Really liked the system and the game, and he didn't actually have any crusading armies, so he didn't buy this particular set of rules, but he certainly wanted to play more games of it. But just recently, he emailed me because he'd spotted in a wargaming magazine that another set of rules by the same author had come out called Soldiers of Rome, which he ordered immediately because he has got 28mm figures for Rome and for ancient Britons. So he wanted to get stuck into this set of rules, which is exactly the same format as Soldiers of God. So it was something that he could do, and I have 15mm figures, not a vast number of them, but certainly enough to play a game. So I ordered a copy as well, and I thought I'd give you a kind of summary of my opinion of these new rules, and play a little game in front of you, give you a sort of battle report, show you how the rules play out, and so on. So comparing them side by side, I mean, you can see there's very obvious similarity in the way the books have been printed and so on. What has changed and what has remained the same is quite interesting, because Soldiers of God is a sort of set of rules that can easily be redesigned for other periods of history, but not for anything later really than the Renaissance, I would say. The game is played with the army split into three battles, so it's not very easy to kind of design a game where all the kind of separate parts of the army act in a more kind of integrated way. So when you get to the Black Powder era, where different branches of the force are kind of cooperating and working according to an overall battle strategy, it makes it harder to design a set of rules that follow this sort of format. But certainly with going back in time to the ancient period, you can certainly do it. The problem that you then have is there's a very clear kind of polarity here, that you have Crusaders versus the Muslim faction. Whereas when you get back to the ancient period, you then have to start thinking about, well, you want Romans in it, so who did the Romans, who were the enemies of Rome? And you have a myriad, especially if you kind of extend the period. So the first thing that the designer's done is to limit the period from the time of kind of Julius Caesar and the 1st century AD. So it's really what you would describe as early imperial Rome is the period. And then they have two kind of opposing forces. One being categorized as barbarians, so that covers everything from kind of the Germanic tribes to the Dacians to the ancient Britons and so on. But they also have the Parthians, who have completely separate rules to the barbarians, and the barbarians have separate rules to the Romans. So whereas here you have it's a card-driven game. I'll show you more of that later on. But whereas here you have cards that can be played only by the Islamic side or only by the crusading side. Here you have to have cards that can only be played by the Parthians, or can only be played by the barbarians, or can only be played by the Romans. And what that does is it kind of obliges you to have, whereas this has got a pack of 52 cards, this has actually had to increase the number of cards to 56. And interestingly, in the text in here, it tells you that the action cards, there are 52 in the pack, and that's one of the signs that what they've actually done is like almost literally cut and pasted a lot of the text of this into this, and then haven't checked it thoroughly enough, and a lot of the text that's been taken from here doesn't apply to this book. That's one of the things that I would. It's not a serious criticism, but it is obvious that has happened. Another thing that has more seriously that has happened is that in Soldiers of God you have an entire chapter. If I can find it here, an entire chapter devoted to desert terrain. So in other words, the type of terrain that would be fought over in the crusading period. And you have this terrain generator table. If you don't want to set the table up with items of terrain of your own choice, you can actually generate it randomly. And you can see that there are all kinds of different terrain types: a morass, a stream or an irrigation channel, an oasis, dense scrub, small hill, rocky outcrop, another small hill because it's random chance of throwing it, two chances of throwing a small building or have a village or a watchtower. Now, earlier on in the rules, there are in the movement, I think it's in the movement section. Here we are. There are the rules for moving across obstacles and across difficult ground, and they're fairly straightforward. Basically, obstacles, you stop at an obstacle, and then you cross it in the next movement turn and pick up a disorder marker unless you're a unit of skirmishers. With difficult ground, you can only enter difficult ground if you're in open order, and you pick up a disorder marker the first time you go into the difficult ground, unless you're a unit of skirmishers. So you can, once you're in the difficult ground, you can move through it without picking up any more disorder markers. But the items of the specific items of terrain elaborate on those two basic rules. So, for instance, in a morass, instead of picking up one disorder marker, you pick up D6 disorder markers. The oasis is inaccessible. You can't cross the oasis. There's one here, I think it's this rocky outcrop, only skirmish units can enter the rocky area, so even if you're a kind of regular unit, if in open order, you can't enter the rocky outcrop, and it gives cover to the unit of skirmishers while they're in there, and so on. And the watchtowers got separate rules as well, and so on. Now, all that, or a similar kind of chapter, is missing entirely from soldiers of Rome. But going back to this business of how they seem to have copied and pasted. How they've copied and pasted the text. You'll notice, say where you're setting up a field battle here, it says generate a battlefield using the random terrain generator or using any other mutually agreeable method. Now, the random terrain generator was in Soldiers of God, was in the chapter on desert terrain, as I've just shown you. That chapter is missing from Soldiers of Rome. Therefore, there isn't a random terrain generator in this book. So that's sort of just an error. But what that means is that in Soldiers of Rome, you don't have any variation in terrain other than you have obstacles like you did in Soldiers of God, and you have difficult terrain. So a lot of the kind of complexity of the terrain has been removed, which is fair enough, except that a lot of the advantages that would go to fighting with skirmish units and open order units in difficult ground or in slightly more elaborate types of difficult ground has been removed entirely, meaning that it seems to me that it's given the Roman force a much greater advantage. A good example would be there's no forests in this particular period, especially fighting in Germany. You would expect there to be rules for forested terrain. There is none. What it means is that the Roman force gains a lot of advantages from the specific rules for the new formations that they've added to this book. I saw them a minute ago. Where are they? I'm not going to be able to find it in a hurry, but basically the Romans can form columns. In Soldiers of God, the formations are very linear, but the Roman force can form columns, and it can also form a testudo. And the column, at the end of each turn, if you're in column formation, you're allowed to remove one disorder marker. So it means a Roman column going into difficult ground will pick up a disorder marker for going into the difficult ground, but then can automatically remove it, and then moving through the difficult ground, it doesn't pick up any more disorder markers. Whereas the barbarian faction, say, which is the one you choose if you were playing the Germanic tribes, doesn't pick up a disorder marker for moving into a difficult terrain, so moving into a forest, for instance, but it doesn't get any cover. It doesn't get the ability to remove any disorders that it had in fighting, and basically it gets no cover, no concealment, no real advantage for moving through the terrain, because the disadvantage with the Romans is removed anyway after the first movement. And then you have a unit of skirmishers, because a lot of the warriors for the barbarians are termed light infantry. So they're light infantry in open order makes them skirmishers. So they're moving about in skirmish order and trying to fight a Roman formation which is kind of packed together, highly disciplined, easily able to kind of recuperate and replenish its fighting ability. If it's in column, fighting with fewer dice, yes, but it's inflicting injury on a 2+, whereas the barbarians are needing 5+ to inflict disorder markers. So the game that I've already tried out, the Romans just sort of absolutely crushed the barbarians. So I'm not sure whether that was an error, whether they sacrificed the terrain chapter for the sake of space, because this book is slightly thicker. It's 120 pages, whereas Soldiers of God is only 90 something, I think. Yeah, 92. So whether they were obliged to do that and couldn't fit any more in the book, and it was a last-minute decision to take the terrain out, I don't know. But it seems to me that it certainly has an effect on the game. And the argument that ancient armies would have just formed up on, on open plains and so on in order to fight battle is true of a Roman army fighting a Roman army, possibly, but it's certainly not true of a Roman army fighting a barbarian army. I mean, the other terrain piece, for instance, hills. There are no hills in Soldiers of Rome, and fighting from a hill gives you an advantage if you are the defender. If you're uphill of someone, then you're fighting from a superior position. So the poor old barbarians can't even stand on a hilltop and gain a slight advantage from that in that respect. So that's the main thing that I've noticed about these rules, that the terrain, the lack of rules for terrain, or the simplicity of the rules, does make the game seem to me slightly less realistic than I found Soldiers of God. And yet, having said that, it plays out with exactly the same kind of thrilling narrative. There's lots of special events and cards that are kind of very nicely designed to play to the strengths and weaknesses of each particular side. So from that respect, I like it. There's one other mistake that I did notice. I don't even know if it's worth mentioning, because again, it's not very important and it's easily understood. But there are things like war machines in the Roman army, for instance. So the Scorpio, it's a single stand. Now it has to be defined as being in close order the whole time, because it's not, you can only enter difficult terrain. So it does come back to this terrain thing. You can only enter difficult terrain if you're in open order, and a war machine can't enter difficult terrain. Therefore it has to be defined as being in close order. And yet on the movement table in here, a light war engine is defined as being in close order. That's fair enough. But when there's something else somewhere, oh yeah, I know, it's on the printout, the quick reference sheet, which is at the back of the, here we go, the quick reference sheet. Movement rates, and you can see they've put the war engines under open order. So that is another example about where they have simply cut and pasted the quick reference sheet from Soldiers of God, where the engines are in open order. So it's been done a little bit carelessly, maybe. It's a really good, enjoyable game. I'll show you. I'm going to go through a game in a moment. I might put it onto a separate video rather than have one really long video, because this sort of discussion has already gone on quite a few minutes. And I think I'll stop at that point and upload this video, and then move on to showing you a game and how it plays out. Thanks for watching.